everybody. Welcome. This is the Inclusion Initiative. I'm Grace Foster, CEO and founder of the Inclusion Initiative. Really excited to be here with you this evening. Really excited that you are here to listen and share the space with us. So grab a hot drink, get cozy. This is going to be a really fantastic conversation. And I want to introduce my guests in just a minute, but just want to remind everyone that's joining us tonight that we are here in conversation as people with lived experience, as adoptees, transracial adoptees, and foster care alumni. And we're going to be sharing our perspective, our insights, our feelings on various topics surrounding adoption and foster care and the history of these systems. So just ask everyone that's here to remember to be respectful and kind and respect the lived experience that we will be sharing with you. But we do want you to participate. So this is a LinkedIn Live. It's also being streamed on YouTube right now. And what I want to share with you is that if you want to share a comment with us or engage with us or ask us a question, please do so in the event chat, and I will be able to see your comments that you put into the comment section. And we would be so happy to engage with you. So you can use the emojis and and love and react to all the things that we're saying. We love to see that too. But yes, please be respectful and kind in this space, and we will do the same. So without further ado, let's get started. And I'm really excited to introduce my guest today. And I do want to first acknowledge that we are all inhabiting, and both at work and in life, right? We're living on Indigenous land, and it is bearing the impact of settler colonialism. And so we just want to recognize that today. And I want to introduce our very first guest speaker. Susan Harness is joining us, and she is an Indigenous award-winning author, activist, humanitarian, and TEDxMileHigh speaker. And she's also a transracial adoptee and foster care alumni. So welcome, Susan. And we also have Rebecca Wellington. She is a PhD and is a clinical instructor at the School of Education at the University of Puget Sound, and author of the new book, really excited about this, the new book of Who is a Worthy Mother? She's also an adoptee. And so these two wonderful, lovely people have agreed to join tonight and share a bit about their work and their activism in the space of adoption and foster care. And so would really love to start us off. I think if Susan, if you want to start us off and just share a little bit about your story. Oh, you're on mute.
I'm dangerous with that mute button. Thank you so much, Grace, for inviting me to be part of this this panel. When I am able to talk about the early years of child welfare, that's a pretty interesting space for me to be in. As you said, I am an adoptee. I am a member of the Salish and Kootenai Confederated Tribes in Western Montana. I was removed by social workers when I was 18 months old. I lived in foster care for 6 months before being placed with a non-native family, a white family. It consisted of mom and dad and me. And we lived, my dad was Fish and Wildlife. And so we lived in very remote areas of Montana and for a short period of time in Washington, in the state of Washington, which means I became well aware of how people saw me. I was an anomaly in many of the small schools that I went to. I was pretty much the only Indian kid in there, and pretty much the only brown kid in there. And so I I became sensitive to the fact that people had very specific ideas of where I belonged and didn't belong in spaces. I felt like I was on the outside looking in a lot of situations. I I it was just kind of a difficult life, and just tried to fit in. And then finally, in my 40s, I decided that I wanted to figure out why I felt the way I did. And if I felt this way, how many other transracial adoptees, how many other American Indian transracial adoptees were experiencing similar types of feelings? So I undertook my study mixing cultural identities with transracial adoption, and interviewed American Indian transracial adoptees. And it was the first time almost all of us had talked about our story in any depth whatsoever. It's from a cultural anthropology point of view, which means that I talk about social structures and I talk about the meanings, the cultural meanings of adoption in America. I talk about the history of adoption, history of American Indian, transracial adoption specifically. But I wanted to go a little bit further than that, and I wanted to start a more national conversation that wasn't part of academics. And so I wrote Bitterroot, a Salish memoir of transracial adoption, which is my story of what it truly looks like. And that's received several awards. It's received a lot of recognition, and it has started a national conversation in a way that I am so grateful for.
Yeah, that's incredible. Congratulations and thank you for doing that work on behalf of all of us. So,
Thank you.
thank you for sharing a little bit about your story, Susan. And Becca, I'd love to turn it over to you.
All right. Thanks, Grace. I just want to kind of piggyback on what Susan just said, because I have a book coming out. It's available for pre-order, and it's called Who is a Worthy Mother? An Intimate History of Adoption. And I really just want to say, I don't think I would have written that book if I hadn't read Bitterroot, really, honestly. So so it is transforming lives on a profound level, Susan. My backstory, I was adopted at about 2 days old, 1975, in the state of California. And I am white. There's a lot of white privilege around my experience, and that I just sort of passed into my white family and didn't even identify really as an adoptee until 2017, when my sister passed away. And being, a white adoptee into a white adopting family, there was a lot of privilege in not having to face a lot of things that a lot of other adoptees have had to face. And so I pretty much lived in denial of being adopted and spent my entire life pretending I wasn't adopted, basically. But you can't do that. There's a lot of tensions around that. And in 2017, my sister died of a drug overdose. She was also adopted, and it just metaphorically tipped my boat over. And I had just finished my doctorate in education history. I work in the field of education, but my research focuses on uh, Indigenous student resistance in off-reservation Indian boarding schools. So I'd been just swimming in this history and learning about assimilation and settler colonialism and all these impacts on identity. And I really knew that I needed to find my roots and find out where I came from. And so I started trying to find out, and I could find nothing. Like every door closed in my face because of sealed adoption practices. And then at a loss, not knowing what to do next, I just started reading everything I could, including Bitterroot. And my therapist is like, and you need to write things down. And so I'm like reading everything that I can get my hands on about adoption, doing a lot of grief counseling and writing, and this book kind of came together. And I still work in the field of education, so I really don't identify yet as an activist. I'm really in awe and inspired by both of you because you truly are activists. I feel really new to this field, and it's because of the writing and the book that I'm, for the first time, stepping into these conversations around adoption and seeing, how deeply it impacts everything in our country. So I'm just really grateful to be part of the conversation. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, love that, Becca. And you are an activist. You can be new and an activist. Like two things can be true at once. And we say that a lot as adoptees and foster alumni, don't we? Yeah, so I'll share a little bit about myself. I founded the Inclusion Initiative, and it's been a really exciting journey. But similar to you, Becca, it wasn't until later in my adult life where I really really explored these identities. I'm a Korean adoptee, so I was brought to the US when I was about 5. And like many of uh, international adoptees, intercountry adoptees, we, don't all know our birthdays. We don't know our ages, or we don't know our real names, all of this stuff. And so that's approximately when I was brought over to the US. But I was orphaned, and the first family I had here in the US, it ended up being a broken adoption. They brought me over with the intention of adopting me, and then after 2 years said, nope, we don't want you anymore. You're a bad kid. So was relinquished and to the state of Wisconsin and put into the foster care system, but into a family that had a lot of children, and spent about a year with them, foster kids in and out, they had a lot of adopted kids. So there was nearly 20 by the time I was there, or after my time there. And I ended up being adopted into that family. And the parents were white. The community was very white, but our family was strikingly diverse. We had many ethnicities and races within the family, including white adoptees. And so we were a very odd family, but also like a very common story within the adoptee and foster care space, right? Lots of kids of color brought into white communities and white homes, and really losing, right, those pieces of ourselves, our culture, not understanding who we are, where we come from, and being told to assimilate and be as white as possible and fit in as possible, and essentially learn, right, how to be invisible. And I launched the Inclusion Initiative actually this year because throughout my whole career and my whole life operating in that way with that mindset, Yet knowing I was different and knowing that I needed support and resources, but couldn't find it. And especially in the workplace, this was very evident. And, for adoptees and foster care alumni, this is an issue time and time again in every aspect of our lives. So, in the workplace, when I realized that there wasn't a system, an organization, a resource for me as a transracial adoptee and foster care alumni to navigate relationships, professional development, different triggers that we experience in the workplace. I knew that if it wasn't going to be built by a transracial adoptee or foster care alumni, it probably was never going to be built. So, because we're learning to be our own advocates and therefore advocating for each other and learning to elevate each other's voices. We're reclaiming our stories. A lot of my friends and other creators in this space, I'm learning so much from them. And one of the biggest pieces that I've really learned and appreciated is that whole power in the reclamation of our stories. So that's what we're going to do here today. And I'm so excited to have both of you on because you have a lot of knowledge about the history of these systems in our country because you've been doing this work, you've been researching, you've been writing about it, you've been interviewing people, et cetera, et cetera. So I would love to dive into America's history of adoption and foster care. And Susan, I remember you specifically saying, right, it was in the name of child welfare, that the concept of child welfare was used to persuade Indigenous people to literally just give up their children, no questions asked, and how that's been really prolific in the adoptee and foster care space. So, whichever of you feels like you'd want to kick off this portion of the conversation, please do. But let's talk about that.
Yeah, I think it's child welfare. When I talk about American Indian child welfare, it is not in a positive way because it's never been designed to be a positive thing. We've had 200 years minimum of genocide, which means they have tried to kill us. They have moved us from one piece of land to another piece of land. They have tried to provide backing of a different religion. All these ways to essentially get us off the land. And the problem was, from a historical perspective, we weren't disappearing as quickly and as efficiently as they thought we should. So how are you really going to start putting pressure on people? Well, you're going to start involving their kids in the people's decision making. So we're going to give you a treaty, and you know what? You're going to sign because we have several of your children, and you're not going to get them back unless you sign these treaty agreements. So what are you going to do? The other piece is with Indian education. If they couldn't get rid of us, they could at least try to get rid of our cultural knowledge and our traditions. So we're going to take your kids. Again, you don't have a choice of whether or not your kids are going to be leaving you. We're going to take the kids and we're going to be putting them in these schools. Now, initially they were religious schools, but in the late 1800s, Richard Henry Pratt decided to become the first government-funded boarding school, starting the Carlisle Indian Industrial School in Carlisle, Pennsylvania. And so children were sent there from a variety of tribes. And, you know, our hair was cut, our heads were shaved, we were given new names, our clothing was burned, the clothing that our grandmothers and our aunties and our mothers had worked so hard on, beadwork and all kinds of traditional decorations in order to show what good people we came from. All of that went into fires. We were given cotton clothing, which if you've stood out in the middle of, say, a Nebraska winter wearing cotton clothing, you know it's not going to be very warm. So all of this stuff happened. We were given essentially about a third grade education. We just needed to know enough English to understand the notes that would be left for us as work notes provided by the people that we would be placed out to, typically farm families. We would need just enough math education to keep just real basic accountings of the items that we might have sold and any change, if any, that needed to be given back. Women were taught traditional female roles. We became laundresses, seamstresses, cooks, sometimes household managers. Boys were taught to be wheelwrights, tinsmiths, farm laborers. And in all of this, we were never given an education that would give us any power. And that was by design. The problem with that is we kept going home. If we lived long enough, when you think of boarding schools today, you know, the white structures in the East where moneyed boys and girls go to learn, you know, the politics and to learn strategy and to learn history and languages. How many of those have a cemetery attached to them? So every Indian boarding school has a cemetery attached to it. And these kids were dying like crazy because diseases would just run rampant through the buildings. We lived in cramped spaces. They were not heated properly. They were not cooled in the summer. We shared bedding. We shared towels. We shared clothing. And things like tuberculosis was just rampant. So we had cemeteries, but if we could, we always tried to go back home and go back to our families, go back to our tribes. So then what do you do to keep people from coming back together? Well, then you take their kids and you place them in closed adoptions where they will never be able to find their way home. And the Indian Adoption Project ran from 1958 to 1967, and it was an informal agreement between the Bureau of Indian Affairs and the Child Welfare League of America. And its purpose was to, number one, stimulate the adoption of American Indian children by non-Native families, and which it did, which we'll go into here in a minute. But it was also to figure out, the study was also to figure out how successful such transracial placements would be. You know, how did the children fare in this? How did the families fare in this? So David Fanchel, who was the creator of this study, had a pool of 395 kids. And from those kids, he followed 97 families that adopted these kids. And through a series of 5 interviews, all with parents, He asked them questions about how they felt about adopting a child from the American Indian race. How did they think the child would fare in these white spaces? How would the child fare in their family? Would their family adapt to having a child of a different race within their family? And what issues, if any, might crop up, and what might those be? And then how well bonded did everybody become over this period of time? Didn't interview any of the kids because, for the most part, all the kids were under 5 years of age when this study was undertaken. So within the first 3 years of the study, it appeared that this was a really successful program. Families bonded, kids seemed to do really well. Everything was great. And then the floodgates opened. And at that point, anybody who had anything to do with child welfare got into the Indian adoption business. And so you had government agencies, you had state agencies, you had private adoption agencies, you had the Catholics and the Lutherans and the Methodists and the Pentecostals and the Mormons and the Jews, among so many other religions. And by 1974, it was determined that between 25 and 35% of American Indian children nationwide had been placed into non-native homes. So when you take about a third of a futures of a cultural future, you have a huge impact on that culture in the almost immediately. It has torn apart families. Women that have been forced to lose their children, they didn't feel bad enough being American Indian women, which is what they did. But now they felt awful not even being able to parent properly. And that parent properly is kind of that hazy gray zone that a lot of people can take advantage of, especially if you have a market for American Indian children. So at that point, and I think Becca's going to discuss the Indian Child Welfare Act of 1978, that was enacted to really literally stop these kids from flying off the reservations. And it's still got issues with it, but they had to do something. So yeah, Indian child welfare, American Indian child welfare is fraught with a lot of historical baggage that we are still living under currently.
Yeah, thanks so much for just enlightening our audience with that history. And, we are talking about, right, the US history of adoption and foster care. But I do want to note as well, because I think it's important that, I guess it, for us who are adopted from other countries and brought into the US, so, we're intercountry and we're also transracial most of the time. That systemic, what you described as like profiting off those children, it was so prevalent in those decades, especially. So I just want to call that out too, because, Korean adoptees, we all saw that New York Times article. It's happening with like the Guatemalan adoptees that I've recently interviewed and got to learn about that history. Just adoptees from all over the world. It was very common to have agencies and people that were profiting off of the adoption of children. And it is why it's such a systemic challenge that we have now within these systems of, right, these really broken results of these adoptions. There are so many broken adoptions. There's a lot of estrangement within these communities, et cetera, et cetera. Things that, we haven't really felt comfortable talking about until we became, right, more comfortable reclaiming our stories. So again, just thought that was important to note. And it's a good segue into talking about how, with the Indigenous community and in general within the adoption community, how the people who birth children, so mostly people, right, who identify as women, but the people who bore children, how this really impacted them and their ability to have autonomy over their bodies, et cetera, et cetera. So, Becca, I wonder if you would elaborate a little bit.
Okay, I want to kind of circle back to something you said, Grace, and then also touch on something Susan said. So in the book, the Intimate History of Adoption that I wrote, I highlight the Korean War, right, 1950s, and then the Vietnam War as these two really pinnacle moments in what I kind of define as the creation of the multi-billion dollar intra-country adoption market, right? And I think it's really important to sort of put that shift, that sort of adoption policy in our country is defined by particularly the Holt family, Harry and Bertha Holt, who during the Korean War literally started taking babies out of Korea, and then passed legislation to make it easy to basically had this pipeline of bringing babies over. Many of them their families were not giving their babies up willingly, and then that sort of transitioned in the Vietnam War with Operation Baby Lift, where thousands of babies were being airlifted out of Saigon from orphanages, where mothers were literally told, you can have your baby back. Like your baby will be safe here during the war, and you can have your baby back. So those two, wars that our country, sort of has in our deep history has really set the foundation for the international adoption market that we see today. So I just wanted to acknowledge that and sort of root that in that history. But going back to what Susan was talking about, kind of the two big trends and themes that I see emerge in the 100-year history that I dive into in my book is one, this idea of assimilation, and Susan really spoke to that with the Indian Adoption Project. And it's also totally prevalent in intercountry adoption, right? That you can take a baby, and babies are being put into white homes, right? So you're taking a non-white baby, and this was sort of the new policy, the Indian adoption policy, just dovetailed right after the Bureau of Indian Affairs assimilation through education, and now it's assimilation through adoption, and then translated into the end of the 20th century with international adoption. So assimilation, right, that you can take a young baby and put it into a middle-class white home, and it will become white, right? That's kind of the story, and it's still in operation with international adoption. So assimilation is a huge piece of it, but the other piece that I just want to that was just startling to me when I was reading about the Indian Adoption Project was at the same time that that's the U.S. government, right? Is propping up the Indian Adoption Project and paying for it and facilitating it, taking Indigenous babies hundreds or thousands of miles away from their reservation communities, At the same time, our government is also facilitating through social work and healthcare the mass sterilization of Indigenous women. And so the other theme I see is this deep shaming of women who are labeled, like Susan was saying, as not good enough mothers. So we have to take their babies from them, put them into good white homes, and then prevent those women from ever mothering again. So at the same time that the IAP was really in full swing in the early 1960s, I just want to read a little stat from the book. Between 1960 and 1980, an estimated 25% of Indigenous women between the ages of 15 and 44 were sterilized by the Indian Health Services, which is a division of the US government's Department of Health, Education, and Welfare. The sterilizations often occurred without the women's consent and without the necessary information and under flagrantly false pretenses. And amazing woman, Dr. Connie Pinkerton-Urie, I don't know if you're familiar with her, Susan. She was a Choctaw Cherokee doctor. She had a number of these women coming through her clinic in Los Angeles who didn't even know they had been sterilized. They were lied to and had been given hysterectomies and didn't even know. And she really did some amazing work in uncovering that trend that was done by social workers in the United States. So that was kind of this other piece that I really saw that's part of these policies and these trends in adoption is the shaming of mothers, of women, and then the controlling of their fertility, taking away, like you were saying, Grace, their rights to autonomy over their own bodies. Yeah. I'm going to stop there. I just talked a bunch. I don't know if either of you want to respond or jump,
Yeah,
from that.
We do have a quick question, just a clarifying question from someone in our audience. They wanted you to repeat the number of women again that were impacted.
Okay, between 1960 and 1980, an estimated 25% of Indigenous women between the ages of 15 and 44 were sterilized by the Indian Health Services, which is a division of the US government's Department of Health, Education, and Welfare. And I just want to share one more. I'm losing it, but yeah, okay. It's shocking. It's shockingly huge. And that was kind of the high point, but I think it's important to recognize that dovetails or that coincides with this pinnacle of forced adoption of Indigenous children, right? So it's sort of highlighting that adoption is really embedded with how we see women and their fertility rights and how society values them as women and mothers.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and we're seeing a national impact on that conversation again, right? And I wanted to ask you, Susan, if you are comfortable talking about it, if you personally met Indigenous women where this happened to, I imagine you did. And just like what, I guess, like describing or like helping our audience like just understand what the impact was on them, to have to go through this, to not even, some of them not even knowing, right, that this happened to them until probably they were trying to have kids for a long time, or there was weird hormone changes because of their hysterectomy that was happening, et cetera, et cetera. So just really curious if you have any like experience with friends or peers or colleagues that went through this.
I have to say I haven't. That's those are the conversations. Like, I feel really comfortable poking around people's lives as children because how else are we going to have this conversation? But I, I, I don't ask, the questions of what might have happened with women my age, or older. Um, it's, I think, to be an American Indian woman in the United States, it is such a shameful thing to be. And I was taught to be ashamed of it, not by my family, but by outside forces. Absolutely. I was talking with my husband one time, and he's so sweet. And he said, "Oh, you must have had just so many boyfriends." And I said, "I didn't have my first date until I was almost a senior in high school." And I said, "And I had to ask him out because he was so introverted and shy." And he said, "Well, no." He said, "I'm sure. I'm sure that, guys liked you." And I said, "I don't know if guys like me or not, but believe me, none of their mothers wanted their sons to be dating an Indian woman, because we had unfairly been labeled as sluts, as promiscuous. We were money grubbing. We were definitely going to be taken advantage of those sons. And so for those boys to stay as far away from us as possible, that was going to be best for everybody." Go
Yeah,
ahead.
I appreciate that. I just, I asked the question because I'm sitting here internally with my jaw dropping at those statistics and just the fact that that even happened in our country. And, we have a couple of comments from the audience, just really sharing that, like, they're shocked that this is so horrendous. And one person said that both of those stats are shocking. I had not thought of how related those two events are, which speaks to, right, the importance of this conversation and importance of understanding and learning the histories of people who are marginalized, because then you know the context. And then you also know that inequity of power, right? And just why it's so challenging for marginalized communities, and for us specifically in the adoption space and foster care space, especially when you're a person of color in these spaces, like that climb it takes to even try to get on a level playing field and try to reclaim your life and make it your own. The history is written for you already, and your future is almost written for you. And for a lot of these women, that's what happened. These decisions were made for them. And so, yeah, no, that's why I asked the question, and I really appreciate you just elaborating on that, Susan.
Well,
And
I did want to say that, you brought up when you talk about, the power structures, I talk about them as social hierarchies. And, social hierarchies have, a very powerful group of people at the top that, I guess in maybe today's language, they're influencers, right? They really influence an entire culture of how we are to see things and how we are to understand things and how we are to define things and what we were supposed to value and what we aren't. And one of my earlier studies, it's unpublished, but I was talking with a group of Asian adoptees. And when I say Asian, I'm talking about Chinese adoptees and Vietnamese adoptees and Korean adoptees. And the one thing that kept coming up, and one woman summed it up really well, she said, oh my gosh, she said, my parents just wanted me to like be a violinist. They wanted me to be a doctor. They, wanted me to get really good grades. And there was so much pressure to achieve. And at that point, my jaw dropped because I realized in the American Indian kids, there was no pressure to achieve anything. Like there was no expectation of achievement from us at all. And so you even have the power structures within white America of who has more value. And I think it's important to point this out. Adoption is a cultural idea, and adoption is not the same the worldwide. Adoption fulfills very specific roles within a culture, but because we are a market-driven culture and always have been in the United States, it would just stand to reason that adoption falls into that market-driven ideology.
I was going to hop in and say, so when Harry and Bertha Holt were starting the whole international, right, starting in Korea, there was, I don't know if, I don't speak Korean, I don't know if this is the case now, but at the time during the Korean War, there was no word for adoption in Korean. And so there was just a total loss of translation in what they were intending to do with these children when they would translate and say, this is what, we're going to take your children. There was just, that was not even a concept in Korean culture, that you would take somebody's child away forever, right? Yeah, so I just wanted to share that. I also wanted to kind of come back to this idea of the power structures, because the other thing that, like, this history, Grace, when I started reading it, and I have a doctorate in history and I've read amazing things, and when I was reading this stuff, I was like, this is insane that we don't know this. Like, that was my first takeaway, was we have to know this. If we can't change what we're going to do in the future with adoption and foster policy if we don't know how horribly wrong we've done it in the past. But the other thing that just really struck out to me when you're talking about power structures is Bertha Holt was actually awarded American Mother of the Year, I think in the late 1950s, maybe early 1960s, which was an award created by Eleanor Roosevelt. I don't know, perhaps you've heard of it, but it is like the pinnacle of, if you were to put the top, pedestal of power and prestige on an American mother, it is winning this award, right? And I put that in the book because it just made me cringe to think, here's this white woman who is adopting Korean babies to literally assimilate them into white Christian American culture. And she is put up as the pièce de résistance of mothers, like that's it, right? Establishing the hierarchy of who is the most highly valued as a mother in America. It's her, right? And saving these babies.
I think that's the biggest issue right there is, that idea of saviorism, that brown children need to be saved, that we don't have a value outside of, and it's not just brown children, it's lower class children. It's children who come from chaotic backgrounds, which tend to be, class defined. I think these are all important things to keep in mind of when we talk about adoption. It's just not merely the movement of a child from one place to another, but it's it's the reasons why all of that happens and how they explain. And I think, we don't know a lot of this history. And I really believe that's by design. And, I come out sounding like like a ridiculous person. But if we don't know it, then we can't provide an argument to it.
Yeah. No, you do not sound like a ridiculous person. What you're speaking is the truth. And I believe, yes, it is by design. That's how, like, these dominant powers work, right? They design systems that work for them and not for the marginalized. And it is the saviorism is, I know you didn't mean it this way, but it is more than idea, right? It is the dominant narrative that is pushed down onto all adoptees, all foster care youth, and elevated to the parents that are adopting these children or fostering these children, that you are the saviors of these children. You are so good. You are so righteous. You're doing so many wonderful things for the world. And yes, you children receiving this benefit, shut up and be grateful. Don't you dare say anything that contradicts that you're grateful. And, one of our listeners just commented on that, right? That's the really frustrating part of that narrative, which reinforces that imbalance of power within families and really uplifts, right, that righteousness, that they're selfless and they're doing so much good. And so the kids who are living this have no autonomy to think for themselves or speak for themselves. I definitely experienced that as both a transracial adoptee and foster care alumni. One of my agencies was Holt, and so I'm sitting here cringing while you're talking about all of that. And I was adopted into a religious home too, and so just it is like such a common theme for adoptees in the United States, these things. And it's why it's important that we're having this conversation, that we're in dialogue, and more importantly, we are sharing this history with each other and the communities. And so I want to explore a little bit about motherhood as an adoptee. And it's so fitting for this conversation, right? Becca, is your book, Who is a Worthy Mother? Um, I wonder if you could talk a little bit about your book and just the themes of motherhood. And, I know you're a mom yourself. We all are. So it would be also awesome to hear a little bit about how you're experiencing motherhood with your lived identity as an adoptee, and what you want the audience to take away from your experience.
Yeah, thank you for putting the book up there. I'm so excited. Yeah, I kind of, the way I frame it, the story I shared, it really, the catalyst for me doing this search was, well, first searching, realizing I can't get any information on my ancestors because of sealed adoption records, that's a whole history. But again, that history and those policies are rooted again in a fear of the evil birth mother, right? Again, and I just want to echo what Susan said, it's not just Black and brown, Indigenous, Asian mothers, it's also poor women, right? So the vilifying of poor birth mothers. So all those policies around sealed adoption, sealed records comes out of the demonization of the birth mother. So she cannot get connected with the adopting family. They're to protect the adopting parents. That's what sealed records are about. But so I couldn't find anything. And the catalyst for the search for me was my sister dying, but 4 years prior to her death, I had my baby girls, and they were the first people I ever met. They're the only people I've ever met who I'm biologically related to, which is just, that in itself is like mind blowing. So the book was sort of rooted in birth and death, right? The birth of my children, meeting my blood relatives for the first time in the form of my children, and then losing my sister. And the piece about my sister is that she was adopted. She had 2 children, one of whom she had to give up for adoption. So and I write a lot about her story and the pain, the trauma around adoption that we can all, really speak to, and just her trauma, not only being adopted, but then having to give a child up, was just um, unbelievable. So, unpacking her story really made me think deeply about motherhood, and like everything you were just sort of synthesizing for us, Grace, around how we really differentially value who gets to mother and who is celebrated as a mother. And I recognize that I was celebrated as a mother because I'm white, I'm upper middle class, I'm educated, and when I was pregnant and I'm married to a man, so I have just layers of privilege. So when I'm walking around pregnant, everybody was like, "Oh, you're so wonderful." And I just kept thinking, what did my birth mother get? What did your birth mothers get? They didn't get that, you know. So that was something I was really wrestling with when I was pregnant, thinking about that. Yeah.
What about you, Susan?
It took me a long time to want kids. I did not, and I think I was so deeply embedded, like Rebecca, of, adoption doesn't affect me. It doesn't affect me in the ways that it seems to affect a lot of other people. I'm fine. Everything's fine here. We're all fine. And but it seems like every few years something happens to remind me, oh my God, this is how it's affecting me. But I do remember the entire time I was pregnant. To be honest, I felt really there was a certain level of sadness for my adoptive mom, because she was never able to get pregnant. She was never able to carry a child. And I thought it must be bittersweet for her, to watch her daughter. And she never thought of me as anything else other than her daughter. It must be bittersweet for her to watch her daughter, carry a child. And like Rebecca, when I held each of my 2 boys in my arms, that's my first thought, especially at that time, because I didn't know, I hadn't made contact with my birth family. These are the people that I'm genetically related to. These are the first people that I'm biologically related to. And when each of them turned 18 months, I just remember just sitting on the floor and just crying, because I thought, how can a child be taken away at 18 months? It just, all of a sudden I had like this realness associated with it. And it's I don't really ever get a chance to, even now, just because I don't have my genetic people mirroring back to me. I still don't really know what I look like, even though I see them, and I still think, well, they don't look like me, but they think they do. But when I look at my boys, it's not like I can sit there ever and say, "Oh my God, you got Uncle Ernie's nose," or "Oh, my daughter just talks like her, cousin so and so." There's still, even with that relatedness, there's still a level of separation that I don't know will ever be bridged.
Yeah. We're all just nodding because we totally get it. We totally understand. And it's really sad for us too, but at the same time, it's so joyful that we get to have birth children and keep them, and it is something I think about a lot. And I
I
haven't.
do I do have to say, as I was trying to raise teenagers, teenage boys can be a handful, and my boys were a handful, um, and I think they come by it honestly. but but I do remember, um, I didn't put this together until relatively recently. I do remember being terrified that if they didn't behave um, at the top of their game at all times, that somebody might call social services. And I mean, I'm not talking about the screaming pans and guns being taken out. I'm talking about kids doing stupid things like at the mall or something. And and that was in the back of my mind. That was a very real fear that I would, as strange as that may sound, that I would have a chance of ever having them removed from me. And when I talk with my non-adoptive friends, like, they look at me as if I'm nuts, because that would never enter into their mind.
Right. Right. Exactly. That's why it's so important that we help our communities understand, right? Our perspective, our lived experience because of that. Because how can we support each other if we don't even know, right? Um, and I have similar feelings to both of you. And for me, I was not, well, supposedly not orphaned until I was 3. So a lot of Korean adoptees, what we have discovered lately, right? And what a lot of us continue to discover is that our records are falsified. So the history that we think we have, what little of it we have on one piece of paper, it's not true. So I haven't dug into my records in terms of if they're true or not, but I was supposedly abandoned at 3, and in the records, it talks about how I conveyed to the caretakers that I had been sexually abused because my birth mother was supposedly a sex worker. And I had lived with her in that kind of environment. And I communicated that to the caretakers at the, 3, or I was like 4 or 5 years old at the time. So your book, Becca, on who's a worthy mother, it just makes me think about that. It really hits home, right? Because clearly she was not considered a worthy mother. So whether I was abandoned, I was actually I was probably taken from her is probably what happened. I don't even know. But the fact that I was probably in that situation of living in poverty with her if she was a sex worker, right? That's the whole point of what you're trying to share is we don't value certain women. We don't value certain people where they're not able to be parents, to be mothers. And I think it's probably so much more common than we can even know, because there's a lot of stories that will never be told. And that's a shame. And so for me, like being a mom now, I have an almost 2-year-old. She's amazing. She gives me a run for my money, which I wouldn't have it any other way. I'm at such a young phase in motherhood and parenthood that, I don't really know how I feel about all of it yet. Like you, Susan, for a long time, I didn't know if I wanted kids. And I write about this in, the things that I share on my platform. But I wrote about how I watched one of my siblings lose a baby and as a teenager, and how, she was so shamed for that experience because we grew up in a religious household. And yeah, I mean, I will never forget that experience. And it made me realize that I could lose flesh and blood like that. And would I ever want to put myself through that? Because it's never guaranteed, right? And like you, Susan, like my adoptive parents couldn't have kids either. And so it took a long time for me to be like, okay, I'm going to try this thing and I'm going to open myself up to that pain. And as my daughter has gotten older and like closer to the age that I was when I was left or taken, oh my goodness, it's hard. I am torn. Like it's almost an out of body experience because I'm seeing this little person that I love so much. Like it's undescribable. And I feel so fortunate to be her parent. I could never, ever, 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 ever give her up. And I would fight like hell if someone was trying to take her away from me. And so it's that out of body experience. I'm watching that piece of my life as a mom. And then thinking about me at her age as I get closer to that 3-year mark. And just thinking about how that trauma, right? And how a little 3-year-old had to go through that. And multiple times, right? I went through that multiple times with the multiple families and orphanage. I was in 2 orphanages too. And so, it just, for me as a mom, it's just really striking to me how I can live this life now. And I'm pretty privileged too. I'm Asian American, I'm East Asian. I am educated too, although the road for me to get there was pretty intense and long. And, I am married to a white man, and like that has enormous privilege too. And just, I'm married to a white man that has a really loving, caring family. So, it's just such a contrast for me that I look at and feel every day. And I'm switching between being the privileged mom that I am now and thinking about the me when I was her age. And it's just, it's a surreal experience, but it's reality. And it's reality for a lot of us who have this kind of adoption and foster care experience. And so, yeah, I mean, the fact that there are people like you, Susan and Becca, who are writing books about this and helping our country, our society, mothers, parents understand, like, this is our lived experience. Like this is what we go through, and this is why these systems need to change. It's really, really, really important. And I cannot thank you enough for everything that you've done. Susan, for your activism for what, the last 3 decades or longer maybe? Yeah. So anyway, that's what I have to share on motherhood as an adoptee and foster care alum.
Well, I think what you bring up is, I think it's an important thing to note is that as adoptees, we sit at a nexus of so many different feelings, and we're pulled in so many, we have so many different tensions pulling at us. You know, I look at my birth family, and I'm never going to pass judgment on my birth family, but we're asked to pass judgment on our birth families. You know, I look at my adoptive family. It certainly wasn't perfect, but I dare anybody in your listening audience to say, I grew up in a perfect household. I mean, there's problems all over the place. So I'm not going to denigrate my adoptive family. You know, the family I've created is amazing, and like you, my husband is white, and there's tensions around that. It's like we're an interracial couple. Some people have a lot of issues with that. You know, I look at my boys, and they're trying to decide who they are. You know, they're in their 30s, and they're deciding who they are. But you know, adoption, of I think, as all of us have been saying, it is a lifelong journey. It has a beginning, but I don't know that it ever has an end to understanding how we can take apart these strands that were made to weave our lives together.
I just also want to share, I think, you know, one of the things I sort of highlight in the book, and this is like an epiphany for me, just sort of coming to this late, is that adoption is traumatic. And if we don't recognize that and acknowledge that, and then we just continue this pattern of just moving babies around or children around thinking it's all fine, and it's not. It's heavily problematic, and it's traumatic. And I just, Grace, my heart just breaks for your mom. Like, I kept thinking, I don't know how much money changed hands in your adoption. I know money did change hands. And why didn't that money go to your birth mom? Like, why, in terms of a policy shift, why wasn't there support for her? She was in crisis. And nobody thought to support her and you together. And that is insane to me, you know.
Yep.
It infuriates me. So
Yeah. Yeah, and I think that's a common thread for a lot of us. And, you know, we as a community, right, we get asked all the time, well, do you support adoption? What do you think about adoption? And I think a lot of us would answer it that way. Where is the support and resources for parents who are a part of marginalized or underserved communities where they don't have to give up their children or have their children taken away from them, either or, right? But that they can be a family and they can thrive. Like, why are we not talking about that? Why do we keep pushing and talking about adoption and foster care as the solution? So, you know, those are policy things that we won't get into today, but I think it's just important to highlight that. And I just want to highlight a couple of comments that have been coming through. You know, we have Nicole saying thank you for sharing the experience and knowledge and how important this is. We've got Leanne, just so many kind words about sharing our lived experiences, shedding light on, the harmful narratives and, what our realities are, showing the inequities and how to think about things differently. And one question from AD is there an organization of Native American adoptees? Susan, do you know? Or Becca, do you know? I mean, there are, but which ones would you want to highlight?
There are, but I think we are so. I mean, as a population, we are only 1.5% to 2% of an entire population, which means that even though there are thousands of us, we're so scattered to the winds. But I know Sandy Whitehawk has a kind of an alliance that she runs up in Minnesota, up in Minneapolis. And that's the only thing that I've heard of. I'll be honest, we have a hard time coming together. There's a lot of trauma that has visited on all of us. If that person who questioned is an American Indian adoptee, he's more than welcome, or she's more than welcome to contact me. But that's the only organization I know of for adoptees. Rebecca, do you know of any more?
I was just gonna mention the amazing work Sandy Whitehawk is doing. And it's First Nations Repatriation Institute, I believe. But I had a chance to speak with her several times, and I highlight her story in the book too. And it's phenomenal what she is doing. So, yeah.
Awesome. And another question, how well are you welcomed into the tribal communities?
Well, that's a really good question. That's a sensitive question. Because we've been taken out of tribal communities, it's so difficult for the vast majority of adoptees I've talked with to be brought back in and accepted in tribal communities. And in fact, that's probably the one thing that so many of us have in common is we've tried to go home, and that going home is unsuccessful on so many levels. Maybe we've had success of meeting up with our families, but the tribe is not interested in acknowledging us. Maybe nobody wants to acknowledge us. I think we bring to mind people's memories of what it means to be ashamed of who you are. If you've lost your kids, whether you're a birth parent or whether you are a community, if you can't keep your children, there is something wrong with you.
Yeah. For Korean adoptees, it's similar in terms of the acceptance into Korean society. And I've been talking a lot with other transracial adoptees of how we're really stuck in between cultures. And that's a big challenge for us because, right, we're American, but not accepted into America. And then we're not accepted into our countries of origins and their societies either. So, for us, it's like we need to create our culture. We need to create a culture for adoptees and foster care alumni where we're living in between these worlds. So, yeah, that is a great question.
And I also want to say that it also, like for me, I claim my space in between. I have stopped trying to be part of anything because it's painful and all you do is get bruises. So I've set up housekeeping in this in between place. I mean, I've hung the curtains, I've decorated. I am absolutely fine here. So it can happen, but you just, you know, you have to find a place where you're comfortable. You have to find a place where you belong, because otherwise it's a painful space. The world is just a painful space.
Right. Exactly. Yes. Yes. But we're going to create those spaces for each other. And this is one of them. So I really appreciate both of you being on. I want to just share how folks can get in touch with you, how they can follow your work, how they can find your books and your other published works. Susan, I know you have a handful. Becca, you've got your first book coming out, Who's a Worthy Mother, but you have others in the pipeline. So really excited to see that and can't wait till those come out. So these are the spaces where you can find all of us. And we really appreciate all of you sharing this space with us tonight to learn, to listen, and to be better allies to adoptees and foster care alumni. Thank you so much, everyone. And until next time, bye.